Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, good afternoon, live from Westminster, where thousands of people are expected to turn out for the People's Vote March, demanding a say in the final Brexit deal. Theresa May is insisting there's no need for another referendum on Brexit, but the marchers have got the backing of a number of key MPs from all parties. Well, it follows another tumultuous week for the Prime Minister, a Brexit summit in Brussels that failed to deliver a deal, and a backlash from MPs on all sides of the Brexit divide over the idea of an extended transition period. Well, here in Parliament Square, today's march will be heading here. If the numbers turn up, it'll be the biggest demonstration in the capital in over a decade. Some of the protesters already down here at the moment. Let's look at how today is expected to play out with Sky correspondent Rebecca Williams.
Brexit. It's the great divider. The issue that split Parliament, the Conservative Party, the Cabinet and even the nation. These students from Bristol will be trying to have their say for the very first time. Some were too young to vote in the 2016 referendum, but were today joined tens of thousands of people marching on the streets of London.
I was 3 days shy of voting against Brexit, but I feel like now if we do get a people's vote, I'd be getting my voice back, because I really felt that I lost it during the campaign by 3 days, which is ridiculous.
I want to stay here, and now I'm thinking about doing a master's, but I don't know whether I can do it in England anymore, and I think that's really sad because I don't know what's going to happen.
And people are heading to London from all over the country.
We are travelling to the People's Vote March in London from Orkney. We've left this morning, it's Friday morning. Our ferry was at 6:30. We've been on it now for just over an hour.
It's not just the public who are split on Brexit, so too are the Cabinet. Theresa May's come under pressure this week by conceding that we may have to remain tied to the European Union for longer. And some of her Tory colleagues have criticised her negotiating strategy.
I have to say to her that in no circumstances I will not be able to support the government in this unless this matter is put to the British people again.
I ask with the greatest respect, what option does that leave us other than going back to the people? What else can we do?
It's time to face up to the fact that Brexit cannot be delivered. Take it back to the people and have a people's vote.
We had a people's vote. It was called the referendum and the people voted to leave.
Joy to the ears of many Brexiteers.
This isn't what they're recommending, a people's vote. It's actually a loser's vote. They lost. They can't accept the democratic will of the public. They only accept democracy when it votes their way.
Whichever side you sit up and down the country, people want their voices heard. These were the scenes as those wanting to leave the European Union took to the streets in Bournemouth earlier on this week. By contrast, these pictures were taken in June as thousands marched at an anti-Brexit rally. Even bigger crowds are expected today, with perhaps even the odd pet joining in the event. Wherever you stand on the Brexit debate, the clock is certainly ticking, with so many unanswered questions for those on either side. Rebecca Williams, Sky News in Bristol.
Well, away from the big rally down in London, Nigel Farage is leading another rally, a Save Brexit rally. He joins me now from Harrogate, that rally taking place today as well. Nigel Farage, Theresa May has said it time and time again. Brexit means Brexit, leave means leave. What are you concerned about? Why do you think Brexit needs saving?
Well, if the Prime Minister was true to her word, and indeed true to her manifesto, at the general election, then Brexit would mean Brexit, and leave would mean leave. Unfortunately, and I was there at the European Summit this week, in very humiliating circumstances, she's agreed to extend the transition period by another year in which we won't make our own laws, won't control our own borders, won't catch our own fish, and she wants to hand over a further £20 billion to do it. So the problem here isn't Brexit, the problem is the Prime Minister.
But isn't it correct that the UK needs the best deal possible? Isn't the best deal more important than the time frame? It may take another year, but if it's a better deal, isn't it worth it?
Look, she's trying, and she said this from the Florence speech, Effectively, she wants Britain to leave in name only, leave the treaty, and then she wants to opt back into vast parts of the European Union. That is not what the British people voted for. We voted to be an independent, self-governing country that makes its own laws, controls its own borders, and frankly, she is now betraying Brexit, and I think unless she changes path very, very quickly, I think her own party will force her out.
Are you scared if there is a second referendum that you would lose?
I tell you what I'm concerned about, the fact that 2 million people voted in that referendum who'd never voted in their lives. If the establishment now goes back to them and says, oh, well, that vote didn't really count, you've got to do it again, I think the damage to trust and faith in our entire democratic system would be enormous. You know, to have another referendum before you've even implemented the first one would be ridiculous. Now, I'm quite happy to have another referendum in 20 years or so when we work out exactly what shape Europe's going to be and how happy we are as an independent country. But this is just the loser's vote. This is the establishment. This is big money, big banks, big business and big politics who love the European Union because it's their way of crushing small and medium-sized opposition. And I'm amazed at some of these students that are going to be in London today. Don't they understand that what they're campaigning for is a European Union run by a bunch of unelected old men in Brussels who we can't vote for and we can't remove?
Sounds a bit like that, the House of Lords, doesn't it? But you didn't answer the question. Do you think you would lose if there was another referendum?
No, I think if there was a second referendum, you would see a wave of public anger. And I think collectively the British people would stick two fingers up to the establishment. I think we'd vote to leave by a much bigger margin. But hey, you know, would Tony Blair accept that? Would Nick Clegg? Well, he'll be off to America, of course, but would he accept that? I mean, they wouldn't accept it, whatever we had to say. So we do need, you know, a real sea change here. We need our politicians to respect democracy, to respect the will of the people. And another referendum just frankly puts us into more uncertainty for another year or two. All we're asking for in Leave Means Leave, all we're asking for is for that referendum decision to be implemented as the establishment promised us it would be.
What if that referendum, what if the question on that referendum was either Theresa May's deal or a hard Brexit? Would you have problems with that? If there was no option to remain on that referendum.
Please? I'm sorry, this hard Brexit is a media invention. Nobody mentioned that word to me during the referendum. This has been designed to say hard Brexit bad, soft Brexit.
Right, well, let's say leaving with no trade deal, just going straight onto World Trade Organization rules.
Well, if we go to World Trade Organization rules, we will be able to reduce the price of food, reduce the price of shoes, reduce the price of underwear, make our own free trade deals around the world, wherever we choose, and now, after this week, save £50 billion. Doesn't sound too bad to me.
So, but my point is, if there was an option on the referendum, one was Theresa May's deal, another was just simply leaving the European Union with no deal, just leaving, would you then welcome that referendum?
No, we don't need another referendum. It's very clear what we voted for. I know we're talked down to with the high and mighty and told
but it's not clear, is it? I mean, we don't...
We didn't understand. No, it's perfectly clear. We voted. I'll tell you what we voted for. We voted to leave the European Union. And all we're asking for is to leave the European Union and to do so, and here's the big mood across this country, to do so as quickly as possible. Just get on with it is the phrase that I hear on the streets more than any other.
But the point is that we don't know what leaving the European Union means. I mean, if we knew, we wouldn't be having all these negotiations, would we? The fact is that the Prime Minister doesn't know yet.
We don't know what staying in the European Union means.
So how should voters be expected to know what leaving means?
No one's got a crystal ball. No one can tell you, in or out of the European Union, what the world will look like in 2 years' time. Of course they can't, economically, politically, or anything else. What we can say with certainty is that if we leave the European Union and do so properly by leaving the single market and the customs union, whatever events come before us in the years ahead, we will be in charge of our destiny and our fate and our rules and our laws. And the people that make those decisions will be directly accountable to us, the voters. That is what Brexit's about. That is what we want delivered. The decision the country took is we're better off shaping our own future than having much of it done for us in Brussels. That's what this is all about.
OK, Nigel Farage, thanks very much for joining us today from March in Harrogate. It'll be interesting to see
Thank you very much.
How the numbers compare up with your Save Brexit rally up in Harrogate and the one down here in London. We'll bring you that later on in the day. In the meantime, Sky's political correspondent Lewis Goodall joins me now here in Westminster, where this rally is going to end. Lewis, do these marches achieve anything? Do they change anything politically? Because we can compare this one to Stop the War, and it didn't stop the war.
No, indeed, and there were far more people then, upwards of 1 million. I'm sure than were here today. Organisers here think maybe about 100,000, maybe a little bit more. I don't think you've got to think today is not just about influencing the government. It's not going to influence the government. The government is not going to. Theresa May is not going to look out of Downing Street just down the road and think, oh my word, look at all these people. Maybe we should have a people's vote. After all, it's also about influencing the opposition, because the organisers of this know if there is going to be a people's vote, if there is going to be a second referendum, then the only people who really could have a major influence in making it happen is the Labour Party. In the event that Theresa May's deal can't get through Parliament, they would need the Labour Party to come out for it and say, look, Prime Minister, this is the way to sort it out. Now, they would much rather have a general election, but they want to show the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn, many of whom, of the people here today, will be Jeremy Corbyn supporters, that is what they want. So, although it's not just about the government, it's about the opposition as well, and I think as well they are very mindful that in the coming weeks, everything is to play for. There could be a general election. There could be another referendum. There could be a change of government. There could be a change of Prime Minister. Who knows? Everything's on the table. So I think part of what today is about is just sending a signal that there is latent support in the country for this. And that is why, as you were just speaking to Nigel Farage, those on the other side want to show their feelings as well and say that they don't want it.
Will it have an impact on the Labour Party? If you look at the last election, the only party that stood up and said, we are voting to remain, was the Lib Dems, and they did really badly in the polls.
Well, it's a journey, isn't it, Jane? Because the Labour Party is absolutely true to say, right up to and including the general election, they were pretty much where the government were. They were just basically saying, well, we'll have a negotiation, we'll get a good deal. Ever since then, it is true to say that the Labour Party, inch by inch, little by little, has been adopting a softer and softer Brexit position, whether that's negotiating a new customs union, saying that they would be part of various other European institutions. And they've done that partly because they know that so much of the 30 seats, so many of the 30 seats that they won last time, their net gains in 2017, were really a Remainer rebellion. Basically, the rule of the last election was the more Leaver a seat, the more likely it was to vote Conservative. The more Remainer a seat, the more likely it was to vote Labour, the greater the swing to Labour would be. And they know they've got to satisfy that constituency. But of course, they have got MPs and lots of constituencies that voted to leave. So that's the tightrope they've been trying to walk. It doesn't seem to me inconceivable that the Labour Party, in the event of a parliamentary impasse, could potentially come out in support of another deal. But of course, if they were to support another referendum, they would then really have to attach their colours to the mast in a way that they've been trying to keep it as nebulous as possible before now. They want another general election. As I say, so much of this is just about trying to influence the next couple of weeks and months, which of course will be so crucial in determining everyone's futures.
Lewis, thanks very much. Dominic, thanks very much for that. Good afternoon, live from Westminster, where thousands of people have gathered in the centre of London for the People's Vote March. They're demanding a say in the final Brexit deal. Theresa May is insisting that there is no need for another referendum on the Brexit deal, but the marchers have got the backing of a number of key MPs from all parties. And of course, it follows another tumultuous week for the Prime Minister, a Brexit summit in Brussels that failed to deliver a deal, and backlash from MPs on all sides of the Brexit divide over the idea of an extended transition period. Well, here in Parliament Square, today's march will conclude. There's going to be speeches around 2 o'clock by the time it gets here. And the projected numbers, if they do add up, it could potentially be the biggest demonstration in the capital in over a decade. Let's cross now down to Park Lane. Sky senior correspondent Ian Woods, who was on that march, which has just kicked off. Ian, what are the numbers looking like?
It's always hard to tell when you're in amongst it. I mean, certainly when people were gathering at Park Lane, it always looks busy. And now that we've moved down to Piccadilly, the whole of Piccadilly virtually appears to be full of people. It's really hard to judge numbers on these occasions until they all stop marching and until they all start getting to the point where we can see them all gathered around Westminster and in identifiable locations such as Trafalgar Square. But it is a big march. It's been helped certainly by the weather and the fact that a lot of these people who are on marches are not usually the sort of people who would come to demonstrate. Perhaps it's the march of the mild-mannered. It's certainly a good-spirited march. And let's talk to some of the people here. You're live on Sky News, sir. Tell me why you've come here, because all of those who voted in favour of Brexit will just say you're bad losers.
No, it's because for peace. the EU has brought peace to Europe. You know, before, Second World War was the third of two Germany-France wars in the previous 80 years, and it's been peaceful since.
Sure, but these are arguments from 2 years ago.
And look at the problem that's coming up in Ireland now, across the Irish border. You know, for me, it's peace. That's the most important thing. Far more than anything economic.
People voted
that
for
as
it.
well.
People voted in favour of leaving this. They heard the arguments and decided not to go with it.
Yeah, but look at how many lies we were told as well. Yeah, people were deceived. So I think it's right that we should vote for the terms that finally become available.
You come up to join us. So why do you think that it is right to frustrate the will of 17.4 million people who voted in favour of leaving the European Union?
Because why ruin the economy? You know, what's the point in voting out? What's the benefits of voting out? Give me one benefit of voting out.
But people heard the arguments when the referendum happened.
I don't care about the people.
It
Shouldn't have gone to the people. Should never have gone to referendum.
You don't believe in democracy then?
What?
That's what you're saying. You don't believe in democracy.
I don't care. There's been one referendum, or the second one will correct that stupid, idiotic decision.
All right. Cheers. Thanks. What? They lost us anyway, didn't they? They opted out of it pretty quickly.
Well, we've lost in connection with Ian there. As you can imagine, it is incredibly busy down there, and that is affecting our signals that we're able to get out as he walks along the march itself. But you can see a considerable number of people from these aerial pictures down there moving throughout the capital. Well, welcome back. We're live in Westminster as what could be the biggest demonstration in the capital in over a decade makes its way to Parliament Square. The People's Vote March left from Park Lane and will end here at around 2 o'clock this afternoon. Let's take a look at the latest pictures that we have. From our helicopter shots, you can see the large numbers of people who are now have gathered, and they gathered from about 12 till 1, and they are now moving throughout the streets of London. The route is taking them from Park Lane down along Piccadilly, along St James's Street, then along Pall Mall to Whitehall, and ending here in Parliament Square at around 2 o'clock this afternoon. Hundreds of thousands were hoped for. There has been one estimate that there could be as many as 250,000 people potentially there today. It is a lovely sunny day here in London. The weather certainly won't have deterred people from coming down. Stop the War campaign received when it held its march back in 2003. Well, down here with me in Parliament Square, I'm joined now by Baroness Shirley Williams, representing the Lib Dems. Hello. And also Lib Dem leader Vince Cable, both down here, both supporting this march. Baroness Williams, why do you think this march today is important?
It's absolutely crucial. It's the last moment when we can actually suddenly stop this whole madness which is going on. And day after day we get the same report from the Prime Minister, who says, I'm so sorry we haven't been able to reach a conclusion. Let me take just one example. It's one I happen to know rather well, which is the example of the Irish border. If we were to simply say what Jeremy Corbyn said, but then did nothing about, what we should do is accept the customs union, we would have ended the problem about the Irish border just like that, and we haven't done it. It seems to be tragic that that's so. And there are many other things like that. The really very worrying thing about public services with less and less money, more and more schools begging for there to be support and so forth. We really have to get hold of this country and start saving it, because things are now really very serious indeed.
But you say it's a mess, but it's a democratic mess, isn't it? We've got here through democratic process.
But we didn't know, not really, because I take your point completely, and this is a democracy. But if you look at the way in which the presentation of the case was made, we began at that beginning. Do you remember that huge bus which was going to save hundreds of thousands of pounds all going to the NHS, which has not had a single pound from all that? The lies that were told in this whole campaign were among the worst I've seen in a lifetime in politics. I'm really quite ashamed of the way in which it's been done.
Let's bring in Vince Cable, Lib Dem leader, and there are going to be a lot of people on this march. We're seeing from the pictures that there are a lot of people on this march, but the Sun newspaper today called it the losers' parade and said that these people here are the metropolitan elite. They're not representing the large swathes of people across the country, the 17 million who voted for Brexit.
Well, it's the group I was in. I was at the start of the march. Is very far from metropolitan. There are busloads of people from Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, north of England. Of course, there are a lot of people from London, but this is across the country, and there is a growing realisation across Britain that many of the people who thought that they were going to get a better deal than they've got at the moment, I think are realising that they were misled and that they're wrong.
And I'll completely support Vince, because at 7 o'clock this morning I got up and took part in a huge train load of everybody. The entire train, there was nothing but people coming to this demonstration, and that was from Oxford and Birmingham, that area. And so I can only say that the facts that I've seen just aren't the way they're presented.
But of course, the referendum vote was close. You know, it was 52-48. It is true that there are large numbers of people in this country who don't support Brexit, but it's also true that there are large numbers who still do.
Oh, of course there are. Yes, there's a wide range of opinion, and that's why it's important that at the end of the process, when we know what the government's got, and they're still far from getting an agreement, when they've got a deal, when we know what's involved, that people have the choice of saying, this is what we voted for, or staying in the European Union. It's important that, I mean, of course, you're quite right, it was started with a democratic vote, albeit one that was very flawed, but we need to finish it up in a democratic way, and that's by having a people's vote.
And the people turned out. Well, I think what's quite clear is a lot of people feel that they were misled, they got it wrong. And when you look at, for example, the way in which the news is coming out about big firms closing, unemployment, people talking about whether they should go, like recently the argument that Unilever should go to Rotterdam, all those arguments are brand new because most people haven't heard them, they haven't been discussed up to now.
But you say that though, but there was the referendum and then there was the election that came after it, and between the referendum, when there was such shock from those who didn't think it would happen, and the election itself, there was time to reflect, there was time to look at the implications, and Vince, your party was the one that said, we're anti-Brexit, and you did very badly in the polls then. You lost 49 MPs. Doesn't that suggest that the public isn't necessarily on your side in the numbers you think it is?
Well, I think a great deal has changed since the general election. We hadn't, at that point, even engaged in the negotiations at all. It's very, very clear that what we were told at the time, that this was all very simple, this was going to be the easiest negotiation in history. It's completely untrue. It's extraordinarily complex, very long-lasting. Even if the government gets a deal, we're going to continue on the present basis within the European Union for another 2-3 years. It's not at all clear what's at the end of it. No, we were not told any of this at the time. You know, many of the other aspects of Brexit, you know, the savings for the NHS, it's, I think, now been established that this isn't going to happen. A growing sense, I think, of worry about where we're heading, and it's entirely right that we take a check.
Shirley Williams, is there any Brexit deal at all that you would sign up to?
Not one, I think, likely to be negotiated by the present government, which is so split on the thing that it can't come up with a straightforward answer. But Vince is absolutely right. Take just one example. Everybody's now getting scared stiff about the budget. Why? Because the level of taxation isn't enough to actually fund the National Health Service, to fund the schools. I was the Education Minister. I get school after school now desperate for money to try and just keep the schools going. And all of that is being looked on as somehow nothing to do with it by the present government. I think Mrs May is quite a stubborn and indeed quite a brave woman, but she hasn't thought through the repercussions for a country like this one, which, for example, at the moment should be addressing some of the most desperately serious problems of foreign affairs, including the dreadful stories that are happening now in the Middle East. And I think we have to have a proper government to do it, and therefore this is a great opportunity to do that.
Shirley Williams, Vince Cable, thank you both very much for joining us. We're looking at the other side of the debate.
I'm sorry, I can't walk backwards.
Yes, sorry, Shirley, I'll let you move off now. Let's cross to the other side of the debate. From Harrogate, the Conservative MP and Brexit campaigner Owen Paterson, who is at the Brexit rally for us up there. Owen Paterson, do you concede that there has been something of a shift in public opinion since the Brexit vote and since the last election?
Very good backing.
Sorry, it's very noisy. I'm afraid I couldn't hear. Could you say it a bit more clearly?
Do you accept that there has been a shift in the public mood since the referendum and since the last election?
Yes, absolutely. There is exasperation that Brexit has not been delivered. Yesterday, my office manager, who's worked for me for very nearly 17 years, said she'd never known such anger and so many emails coming in because they're being frustrated. 17.4 million people voted to leave. There was a very clear decision by the House of Commons to give that decision to the people, and they decided. And then we had a general election where the Conservative Party said leave can be interpreted, and we will deliver, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and leaving the remit of the European Court of Justice. And helpfully, the Labour Party said much the same. So 85% of the votes at the last general election endorsed the leave vote, interpreted as leaving those three main entities of European power, and obviously taking back our powers to decide money issues.
But having said that, Mr. Patterson, since that date, of course, a lot of... Sorry to interrupt you, but just pointing out that since the election, we have learned so much more about Brexit, haven't we? We've learned so much more about the great unknowns. That, you know, a lot of people will argue that they didn't fully understand all of the implications by the time of that election.
No, I think this is patronising contempt of people voting. People came up to me on the day we voted, guys coming off building sites, covered in dust, and said, Mr. Patterson, it's about them, isn't it? It's about getting rid of them. We can get rid of you in an election, we can vote you out, but we can't get rid of them. And this is ultimately a question of democracy. And there will be the most shattering damage to the integrity of our democratic institutions if we do not deliver what people voted for. People voted on that day who had never voted before. They got registered. The polling officer said to me he'd never seen numbers like it. That was a huge exercise in a democratic will being stated on the ballot paper. And we have to deliver that. And the Conservative Party promised it would. The Labour Party endorsed it. We've made good progress so far. We've got the Withdrawal Act through now, which repeals the 1972 European Communities Act. So we are heading to leave. But people expect us to leave properly, not have the muddle and mess that's being proposed by Chequers, where we will not be making our own laws and we will not be in full control. That's not good enough, and I certainly won't be voting for that.
But that is the point. You know, you say it's patronising to say people didn't know what they were voting for, but the Prime Minister doesn't know what Brexit, the shape of Brexit. The Conservative MPs, Labour MPs don't know what shape Brexit is going to be. Why is it patronising to say that many people didn't fully understand all of the facts? Because the facts still aren't known, the facts still aren't understood. We don't know what Brexit will look like.
But they did. The Prime Minister and every other Conservative MP was elected on a platform of delivering Brexit by leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and leaving the remit of the European Court of Justice and taking back control of our money. And that is very important, the money. I mean, yesterday I went to a primary school. You know, small children being taught in 1950s buildings where it's so cold in winter they have to wear overcoats. Why should their parents see 39 billion being handed over to the European Union? We don't pay to trade with the United States. We don't pay to trade with China. And if there's this appalling offer of a further transition extension, we get led into the next financial round, we could be in for another 10 or 15 billion. These are significant sums of money which every single MP could direct to their own constituency and have spent much, much better. So every Conservative MP was elected on a platform of leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and leaving the European Court of Justice's remit. And the Prime Minister is honour bound to deliver that.
But this £39 billion isn't money that we are paying for trade. It's money that we are paying for obligations, things that we've signed up to and promised to pay for before Brexit.
No, the House of Lords Committee came up and said we didn't do anything. Obviously, there are certain programmes we might want to carry on with, which are value educational programmes, Erasmus, whatever. But we should have an entire decision on how that money is spent. And if we get into the next round of spending, then we don't. We are locked in, and there will be no incentive for the European Union to ever let us go. They'll be making laws without us in the room, without us being the pebble in the shoe, trying to bring sanity to their lawmaking. We'll be continuing to be paying significant sums of money, and I think that's wrong. I think we could spend a lot of that money much, much better on good causes here. Every single person in this country will know their local school needs more money, they would like more money in their local hospital, more doctors, more nurses, more policemen. There's plenty of ways you can spend 39 billion much better than handing it over to the European Union.
OK, Owen Patterson, thanks very much for joining us. We'll leave it there. Let's get more, though, on the People's March from the centre of London with Sky correspondent Adele Robinson. Adele, organisers are saying they believe 500,000 people have come along today. Shirley Williams a little earlier saying she'd heard a 250,000. We don't really know the police figures yet, and we can sort of work out a number in between all of them when we do. But what's your feeling about you're down there? What are the numbers like?
Well, as you say, it's impossible to tell, but as you can see from behind me, the numbers are pretty huge, and they just keep coming. The organisers have themselves described this as the march of a generation. We just move out of the way and show you the sheer numbers that we're dealing with here. Thousands upon thousands of people all coming together for this march, the people's vote. It's important to remember, though, that thousands of people across the country disagree with this and do not believe that it's the right thing to do. So we are here with the Wallace family from Banbury. Thank you very much for joining us. A whole family here coming out. Just give me a sense of why you felt strongly enough to come down to London today and take part.
Okay, well, for myself, I guess it's because I'm a mother and I have 2 sons. So I want them to grow up in a united Europe. I feel very European myself, and I think that we all need to stand together and work together.
Okay. I just mentioned there thousands more people across the country disagree with this. The people who voted to leave stand by their decision, and they say that this is potentially another people's vote would erode trust in democracy.
Well, I'm afraid in democracy, people sometimes make mistakes, and when they make mistakes, they need to go back and look at the question again. And I think the sheer numbers here today prove that point, that there are many, many people actually who have changed their mind and want another vote.
Okay, it's called the people's vote, but obviously, again, people who want to leave the EU say that there's already been a people's vote, and that should be stood by. And if we dishonour that by going forward with another one, what does that mean? What precedent does it set?
Okay, well, people did have a vote, but other people actually, like my son here, did not have a vote. They are the people who are going to have to live in an England without, partnership in Europe. So maybe he should speak.
Yeah, let's just have a quick word. It's Hal, isn't it?
Yes.
Why did you come out today?
It's something that I feel quite strongly about. As my mum alluded to before, I actually didn't have the chance to vote, and a lot of my peers didn't either. And even when I was 16, I think I was quite shocked at the dishonesty of some of these so-called politicians. So I think it's really important that young people like myself get out here and let it be known that, we don't want to live in a country where bigotry and dishonesty in politicians is allowed. And I think it's really important that the young people who didn't get a vote, as my mum alludes to again, are able to have a say now on a final deal.
But that happens with general elections. If you're not old enough to vote, then you have to live with that decision. So why should there be another chance for people who weren't old enough?
Well, a general election would be, 4 years or less, and then you have the chance to have your say. This is something that could affect my entire life, and, so I think it's really important that I take a stand now.
Thank you very much for joining us, the Wallace family from Banbury. Let's just finish with showing you again the sheer numbers still coming along here on their way to Parliament Square. A lot of people together, but of course, Jane, important to remember that this still remains an incredibly divisive issue, with many people fundamentally disagreeing with the reasons behind this march.
Indeed, Adele, thanks very much for that. Well, that march due to arrive here in Parliament Square, as Adele was saying, in around the next 15 minutes. There are already quite a few people who are gathering here in the square in advance of it. We're going to be covering the rest of this march and, of course, the contrary march up there in Harrogate as well throughout the day here on Sky News. Don't go away. Well, good afternoon, live from Westminster. We're here at the People's March in Parliament Square. The march is actually still going on. It left up by Hyde Park, Park Lane at around 1 o'clock this afternoon. Estimates from organisers here are that as many as 670,000 people may have joined that march. We haven't had any official confirmation of figures yet from the police, but it is an extraordinarily large number. Still a long way shy, though, of course, of the 2 million people who took to the streets for the Stop the War march. back in 2003, but it is clear that a large number of people have turned out today. They're now congregating in Parliament Square to hear speeches. We've heard from Richard Bacon, Mariella Frost, rather bizarrely Delia Smith, Sadiq Khan, and now we're hearing from a Labour and Conservative MP. Also down here today is Labour peer Lord Adonis. Why do you think today is important?
This is people power. Behind me, you've got hundreds of thousands of people, all of whom want their say on Theresa May's deal when she comes back from Brussels with her deal later in the year. They don't think it's good enough that this is decided just by politicians in the Palace of Westminster. This is going to affect them and their future. And there are a huge number of young people on the demo today. And what they're all concerned about is they're going to have to live with the consequences of this for 40, 50, 60 years. And one of them said to me, do you know, I don't want to be shut up on a small island with Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. And that's what it's about this afternoon.
But they're also shut up with half the population who wanted Brexit.
2 years ago, people didn't know what Brexit would mean. They couldn't know because there was no Brexit deal. Do you remember all we had was the side of a bus, 350 million a week for the NHS, 7 million Turks invading imminently if we stayed in the EU. Now that we can see the truth and not the lies.
If people chose to look, the information was there. Leaflets went out to all households in the country talking about leaving the single market and the customs union.
That's not actually correct, because 2 years ago the government hadn't started negotiating. And on the single market and the customs union, Boris Johnson, remember, said that we would be staying in the single market and the customs union. It's like buying a house. You know, you see the estate agent's blurb, it looks great, and then you conduct the survey. And when you conduct the survey and you find out that you've got dry rot, that you've got the neighbours from hell, that the kitchen isn't fitted, as you said, loads of people drop out at that stage. That's what's happening to us as a country at the moment. We're conducting the survey on Brexit. The government's already agreed to a £50 billion exit deal as a result of the costs of Brexit. We're seeing a border in Northern Ireland. We're seeing that jobs are going to be lost. Companies are moving out of the country because we're not going to be in the customs union and the single market. And young people are really worried about their futures and their ability to travel, work and live their lives across Europe. So they want their say, and that's what today's all about.
But the referendum that was held wasn't a referendum on a survey. It was a referendum on whether or not we leave the EU. And the overwhelming majority of people who voted to leave the EU. This isn't like buying a house, this is politics. And when you vote in a referendum, you leave it up to the politicians to make all the plans, to make the final decision. Surely it should be up to them and up to MPs in Parliament to vote on the final deal.
The crucial thing is 2 years ago we didn't know what the deal was. Now we do know what the deal is going to be. At least we will do by the end of the year because it's being negotiated at the moment, but we already know a lot about it. We're not going to be in the customs union, we're not going to be in the single market, we're not going to have freedom of movement across the Europe as we've had in the past, and crucially we're going to have to pay 50 billion in order to leave. Now this is the biggest decision that we will take in this generation. It's going to affect the people behind me, it's going to affect their lives day in, day out, and if they're young, maybe for half a century, they want their say. This is a democracy, that's quite right.
But what about those who will say that it is a democracy, that all of those people in the rest of the country who voted for Brexit and they're not going to be represented? The Sun today described those down here as a mass toddler tantrum by the latte-supping Metropolitan Sore Leaser Brigade.
Yeah, that's just people writing cheap newspaper headlines. The fact of the matter is, if there is a people's vote, everybody will get to vote, whether people voted leave or remain 2 years ago. But the question will be very different. We'll be able to see the deal, we'll be able to see the costs for every man, woman and child in the country. We'll be able to look at the consequences in terms of not being able to move freely across the continent, jobs being at stake and so on, and then people can make their own decision. But remember this, the people cannot betray the people. The supreme act of democracy is the people voting, and that's what this huge crowd today is asking MPs to do, to submit the treaty to the people and let the people decide.
Lord Adonis, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's go down to talk to some of those people in the crowd for us today. Adele Robbins, who's been walking along with the marchers. It's making very slow progress, I have to say, since leaving Park Lane. Adele has now just made it to Trafalgar Square, I do believe. Adele.
Yes, that's right. The crowds are coming still thick and fast. We thought it would be over by now, that everyone would be in Parliament Square where you are, but clearly not. You probably make out behind me the sheer numbers of people. I have some of them here with me now. Let me just quickly go through where you're from, first of all.
I'm Fiona, I'm from Dover. Holly from Northern Ireland.
Emily, I'm French.
Imogen from London. And Robin from Aberdeen.
So, Let's start with you, Robin.
Sure.
You've come all the way down from Aberdeen.
Yeah, a small town called Huntley.
Just for this?
Yeah, just for this. Yeah, I actually came down with my organisation. It's a small arts organisation, and we have a march happening in Huntley at the same time. So there's about 50 people up there and about however many 100,000 up down here. So,
And just give me a sense of why you felt that you needed to come all this way today.
Well, I feel like it was really important for us to join this because 62% of Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, and we didn't vote to leave the EU. And I feel personally like I don't want to live in a country that doesn't share my values, and I want to be part of this European family. And I feel like it's important to say that. Yeah.
But as the referendum was held a couple of years ago, and that was seen as the will of the people. So when people talk about the people's vote today, and this being the will of the people, well, we've already heard the will of the people, haven't we?
I actually think that's a bit mad because you're basically saying people can't change their minds, and people change their minds all the time. It's actually undemocratic to say that you can't give people a second vote when people are clearly crying out for it. You know, I've spoken to so many people today who have changed their minds and want to, have a second referendum and will think about things in a slightly different light because they were told something in the beginning that doesn't hold now, doesn't hold true.
Just quickly ask some questions. So we're just hearing there, people can change their minds, but a lot of people across the country haven't changed their minds. They voted for leave, they want to still leave Brexit, and they see this as a breach of trust of democracy.
But I think actually the breach of trust happened when basically the politicians lied to us. I mean, I think a lot of the pre-referendum rhetoric was just blatantly untrue. Like we had, the famous Brexit bus with however much money was going to the NHS. It's just like it's not true. And I think that actually now that we're getting these facts and things like that, we should be able to actually have a vote based on that rather than based on hyperbole and I think small-minded thinking.
Richard Tice, the founder of Leave Means Leave, has described everyone here today as losers and the people who haven't been able to accept that they lost the vote 2 years ago. What do you say?
Well, coming from Northern Ireland, it's such a big issue, and I think they've slightly been forgotten, and I think I've talked to a lot of people that are very concerned that Northern Ireland's been forgotten and the border issue just hasn't been dealt with. So if he thinks we're losers, then fine, say it, but it doesn't make a difference.
And just quickly, you're French, so
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on this? Why are you here?
Well, I mean, I've been living, studying, and working in the UK for 7 years now, and I feel like I'd like to stay, and I'd like English and British kids my age to have the opportunity to live and study and work elsewhere in the EU. And I think for our generation, that freedom of movement is something we've grown up with and something that we've sort of built our future around. And so taking it away from us seems pretty harsh.
Well, thank you very much for your time, everyone. I'll let you rejoin the march. So we hear from people from Scotland, all the way from Scotland, from France, and then across the rest of the country. A lot of young people here, though, I must say, a lot of students too, clearly coming together for a cause that they believe in. But that said, there are a lot of other people across the country who believe fundamentally this is the wrong reason to have this march.
Adele, thanks very much. And as Adele is talking to young people there on the march here on the stage here in Parliament Square, a selection of other young people from across the UK standing up, giving their points of view about why they think Brexit is a bad idea. Well, whilst today has been happening here in London, meanwhile, a Save Brexit rally has also been taking place up in Harrogate in North Yorkshire with leading Brexiteers involved, including, of course, Nigel Farage. Our correspondent Becky Johnson is up there. Becky.
Yeah, this is a rally by the group Leave Means Leave, and nowhere near the sort of numbers here. You can probably see in the hall behind me around 1,200 people. But I put to Nigel Farage that there certainly weren't the numbers here that we're seeing in London, and he said that's because this is one of a number of events being held around the country. And he said they have evidence that their events, including this one, are live streamed by people into their living rooms, and they say they've been watched by over 1 million people. Now, the crowd here have heard from Labour MP Kate Hoey, Conservative MP Owen Paterson, but the biggest cheer was reserved for Nigel Farage. He received a standing ovation. His message is that there's nothing wrong with a hard Brexit, that the government just needs to get on and get us out of the EU, and that is a message that's gone down very, very well with the crowds here. Certainly the Prime Minister's Chequers plan is incredibly unpopular here. Now, I have spoken to a number of the Leave voters attending this event here in Harrogate. And, you know, there is a range of opinions. Some of them do feel that the Prime Minister should be given the time to go ahead and get a deal. But the main feeling that I'm feeling is one of impatience among the voters. Harrogate, a strange choice of venue for this rally, because this town actually voted to remain in the EU. And there was a smallish protest outside of this as people were turning up. But a number of the speakers here have referred to the idea of a people's vote as a loser's vote. They say that we already had a people's vote back in 2016, and they say that they won it.
Becky, thanks very much. Well, the speeches are continuing down here in Parliament Square. The marchers are still continuing to arrive in the square, trailing all the way back as far as Trafalgar Square, we think, right at the back of the march. So considerable numbers have come down into London today. The fine weather has definitely helped with that, potentially. But they are here to make their voices heard. They don't know what political impact it will have, but they are certainly hoping, those who've come down here today, that it will have some kind of political impact. We'll have lots more from Westminster throughout the day, but for now I'll hand you back to Nick. Good afternoon, live from Westminster, where tens of thousands of people have gathered for the People's Vote March, demanding a say in the final Brexit deal. Organisers say more than 700,000 people may have turned out today. No official confirmation of that so far, but I have to say that the speeches have long since finished and the march still is continuing. They are saying that the march is still stretching back all the way along to Hyde Park. Well, it follows another tumultuous week for the Prime Minister, a Brexit summit in Brussels that failed to deliver a deal, and backlash from MPs on all sides of the Brexit divide over the idea of an extended transition period. Well, Theresa May's insisting there's no need for another referendum on the Brexit deal, but the marchers have the backing of a number of key MPs from all of the parties, and they've all been making speeches on the stage behind me in the last hour. Well, let's get more on the People's March. On the march itself, Sky correspondent Adele Robinson. Adele, what kind of motivation have people got? Why have they come along today?
Well, for exactly what it says on the tin, really, for the people's vote, or what they describe as the people's vote. Let me just show you that what's happening here at the moment. We've moved a little bit away from the march itself because a lot of the marchers and the protesters have begun to spill out. The numbers are still pretty dense over there as people try and make their way down to Parliament Square. We have a couple of marchers here with us, Brian from Bath and Muffy all the way from Italy. We'll start with you, Muffy.
Yeah.
You came all the way from Italy. Why?
Because I'm a scientist, I'm a marine scientist. I've worked in the game for 35 years in the UK. I've made a huge input into the UK's marine science, and we are busy with Brexit, absolutely trashing the programmes that are so important in terms of collaborative science with the EU. And that's why I'm here.
Okay, and what do you make of the argument from people who voted to leave that Brexit referendum back in 2016 showed the will of the people, that this isn't the will of the people, that was the will of the people?
I think they were ill-informed at best. That's all I can say.
I mean, we've spoken to people this week who voted for leave and who said that they would still stand by that decision, you know, despite more information coming out, as you say, over the last few years.
Yeah. I've also spoken to a lot of people who voted to leave and have now changed their minds in light of what they know now, as opposed to what they knew
out of Europe now. Leave means leave.
Okay, so obviously people very passionate here.
Clear.
Yeah, it is. But of course, you know, thousands more people as well still voted to leave, and they say that a call for another vote would really breach any trust in the democratic process. I mean, what do you think, Brian, to that argument?
Well, I think that people had a vote and they made a decision at that time. But as some of the placards say, you know, democracy doesn't stop there. It's an ongoing process. And I think people have more information perhaps today than they had 2 years ago. And I think if people want another vote in order to act on the latest information, then perhaps they should have one.
Thank you both very much for your time. Sorry we haven't got longer to speak to you, but I'll let you get on to Parliament Square. I think that's where you're headed now, so nice to meet you. So yeah, just another couple of people. Muffy all the way from Italy, Brian from Bath, but there's been people coming from different parts of Europe as well here today, and across Britain itself, all the way from Scotland. We spoke to earlier people from Northern Ireland. And while the numbers are pretty large, I would say, we still don't know exactly how many people have turned out, believed to be maybe 500,000. That's according to the organisers, though. Some other people think that maybe it isn't quite that much. But people coming together nonetheless, although we must remember that there are still thousands more people who fundamentally disagree with calls for a people's vote.
Indeed. Adele, thanks very much for that. The latest that we heard here from one of the presenters on the stage was that it was over 700,000. The organisers estimate took place today. Good afternoon, live from Westminster, where tens of thousands of people have gathered for the People's Vote March, demanding a second referendum, a say in the final Brexit deal. Organisers estimate that more than 700,000 people have turned out. There's been no official confirmation of this so far, but the crowds are still travelling through the centre of London. We think the demonstration at the moment is stretching back still as far as Trafalgar Square, so Whitehall is still packed. The speeches now here in Parliament Square have long since been over. We heard from a number of politicians, including Chuka Umunna, Vince Cable, and also Anna Soubry and the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan.
Many of the young people marching today, their voices weren't heard 2 years ago. It's their future that's on the line. And as I say, what are the politicians in Westminster so scared of? What are they scared of in relation to the British public having a say on whether they accept the deal done by our Prime Minister or whether they want to stay in the European Union?
Well, here down at Parliament Square, I'm joined now by Adam Bradford, who is described himself as a social and political activist. You write for a lot of different publications. Why do you think today was important?
Well, today I think is one of the biggest and most important marches we've had in recent history. You know, if you go back and look at what happened in 2016, there was no information out there. We had political, opinionated pieces coming out from Remain and from Leave. And here today we've had people who voted Remain, people who voted Leave, and people who didn't vote at all. This is not about going back and kind of reversing what was voted for in 2016. We're asking for information. This is an appeal for information about what the final deal will be, how that affects people, and then the people should have the right to decide on whether that's going to be good for the country and that's in line with the Brexit they voted for. And if it's not, we need a radical rethink. And I think that's going to lead us to a general election if we don't get a decision on that.
But when you say that, you know, we get hundreds of people writing into Sky, to email, on Twitter, saying this is really patronising. We knew exactly what we were voting for. We voted for Brexit. We voted to leave the EU. We voted to leave the European Court of Justice. We voted to leave the single market. We knew what we were voting for. We just want the government to implement it. Well, they're the ones who did, and they say they did.
Well, I think, you know, people are going back and kind of in hindsight looking at, oh, well, we thought we voted for this, but actually what we're seeing is the deal that's going to come back might not actually necessarily reflect that 100%. And, you know, the founding fathers of Brexit came along and put the thing out there and said, you know, people vote. Do you want to stay in? Do you want to leave? And it's not as arbitrary as that. You know, that's very polarizing. And the detail wasn't there. And that's what this march is about. We need the detail. We really needed to know before we ever had the first vote around what kind of things can this government actually negotiate. And at the moment, it doesn't look like anything very substantial.
The Sun today has dubbed this event the Losers' March. It says it is the metropolitan elite who are whinging, essentially, because they didn't get their own way.
Well, we get all these words coming out. You know, I've been called a snowflake today. I've been called a Ramona, this, that, and the other. You know, use whatever kind of words you want to paint this as something that it's not. But the People's Vote movement is all around asking for the information. We need a plan. At the moment, there isn't really a solid plan. And if we go with checkers or whatever variation gets negotiated on in the next few weeks and months, a lot of people on both sides of the camp, Remain and Leave, are not happy that that's going to deliver what they voted for. So I think now times have changed, the will of the people has changed, and the government needs to stop being blind about that.
But how can you say the will of the people has changed? What evidence do you have that the will of the people has changed?
Well, look at the 700,000 people who are here today. How many people were
voted to leave?
I'm glad I turned up.
Yes, they did, but 48% of people voted to Remain as well. And I think the country's in a very, very tricky balance where really, I think the whole thing with Brexit was about infighting in the Conservative Party. It was about clinging on to leadership. It wasn't anything about whether we should leave Europe or not. You know, people here have been booing and cheering at different politicians. You can see, people know that this was about politics and party politics. It wasn't about Europe or the European Union. And my generation, you know, the millennials, you know, 16 to 30s, are very, very worried. And we've basically been bullied into a Brexit, which I feel like we don't really have a say in how that's going to go, because the repercussions are going to take 10, 20, maybe even 30 years to come into full effect. So we need the information about what this deal is actually going to entail.
What should it say at this second referendum's ballot?
What should it say? It should say...
Should the option to remain be in there?
Maybe it should. You know, I'm probably not the right person to say, but I think...
But isn't that fundamentally what the whole point of it, that it is another referendum on the same question that was asked?
No, it's not. It's fundamentally not that. This is a vote around whether the deal is fit for purpose, and if it's not, we're at a stalemate where the government and our elected parliament have to choose what we do. And that's where we go to our MPs and talk about what needs to be done. But it's absolutely not about saying, oh, do you think now 2 years on, do you still want to remain? Do you want to leave instead? You know, no. You know, it's not about reversing what God said 2 years ago.
Because there are those who will argue that it's simply sour grapes, and that
No.
What if you don't get the result you want this time? Will you have a third one?
No, absolutely no. This is about voting about the information in the deal. We don't know what the deal is, so how on earth can we go forward with a Brexit? And no one knows what on earth it's going to do.
We shall see. Adam Bradford, thanks very much. Certainly a large number of people turned out today. A lot of people down here very supportive of what Adam has said. And we have seen politicians from all of the major parties, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dems and the Greens and the SNP on the stage here, as well as a number of celebrities, including Deborah Meaden and Delia Smith, who came out today to express their feelings about Brexit. As we've been reporting on Sky, there has also been a counter-demonstration up north, where Nigel Farage has been a demonstration to try to save Brexit. But certainly in terms of numbers, this demonstration down here in London certainly had by far the largest number of people attending.
I've been getting